Because I'm thinking about water and forests because I'm here now, and I feel a certain level of responsibility to know about my environment and to care for it. And so I was excited also to meet Pandora yesterday because she has a farm that she's stewarding.
Yeah, and we were like, for two black women, because I was like, okay, this is not very common. So
I went to your screening about this beautiful film about water. And I think the day before that, I got an email from John that he's releasing this book, Evergreen, about forests. And we were talking about having dinner, and he was supposed to have dinner, so I thought, well, we'll just combine these two dinners and we'll introduce them and we'll talk. I thought we could talk about water and forests. I did join my neighborhood fire safety group because I didn't know anything. I didn't know what to do. And I'm thinking about this land and that we have this pond, and I'm thinking about the underground aquifer and how we pull water from it, and the vineyard across the street, and I want to understand these things. And so that's my curiosity and reason to want to pick your guys' brains, all three of you, and anyone else here who also wants to offer or ask any questions, because here in California we face drought and we face water questions, and it's something that the whole planet is facing. So it's a big topic, and it's not oh, we're gonna solve something, but it's just sort of an exploration about what I want to know what I should be doing, what small things I should be doing here, and maybe we can share that. So I'm just that's kind of the idea of the genesis of this.
So thank you for bringing us together. It's really great. And I'm an environmentalist, and now I'm a writer, and I love photography too, and I love mountain biking, and a little bit of building, which I do with Jessica. And my current employment is with a foundation that works with indigenous communities on stewardship of land and water.
which one?
It's called Niatero. It's in Seattle. Yeah, but I work from my home.
Yeah, what to say? I've been working on this film about water for 6 years now, and
How long have you lived in Sebastopol?
and I've been in Sebastopol for 7 years. Yeah, come from the East Coast where water is quite a bit more abundant, so that's been a big learning journey. Yeah, I'm in a big question about what's next, and look forward to having some conversations about what feels meaningful to do in this time. It feels a little hard to find the compass right now, just with all the changes. So, feeling a lot, processing a lot, and listening a lot. You know, one of the main things that I wanted to tease out with the film in an artful way, and something that I learned that I'm surprised we don't learn more, is about the small water cycle, and that trees and vegetation are pulling water from the ground and sweating it up in the atmosphere through their bodies, and that water vapor is essential for regulating the climate. And so as we've developed our landscapes for cities and agriculture and grazing land and any human paradigm of development, we've broken that cycle of water, and that is having huge ramifications. And so that's a really simple thing to look at that I didn't know. I wasn't aware of the quality of impact that that's had. So the film explains that in a certain way, and then tries to show what it would look like to redesign human life in a way that helps that circle to continue to exist. So how to have cities that act like ecosystems, and how to farm in a way that is storing water and supporting that cycle. Yeah.
So Pandora, on your farm, how are you dealing or thinking about water and trees and all of that?
I'm not sure. Well, first of all, I don't call it my farm.
Okay.
I talk about that I am stewarding with all of the human and more than human kin. The more than human kin have been there longer than me. Octavia Butler wrote this book, Parables, Parable of the Sower, and in it she had this community called EARTHseed. And I read that 20 years ago in grad school and knew when I read it that this was something I was supposed to do because my family were sharecroppers. My mother was born in the South as a sharecropper, which is a horrible way to be introduced to the land. And so that damaged a lot of our relationships with the land. But luckily my mother and father still taught me to be in right relationship with the earth. And so I always knew there was a piece of land waiting to steward me. And then when I read Parable of the Sower, it was like, it's going to be called EARTHseed, which is crazy. And so there's kind of several of us. I took the lead and purchased the land because in my experience, if you try to get a collective of people to do something like that, usually the people end up fighting and you never buy the thing. At least for the people I've tried to organize with. So there's like 5 or so of us that they were like, just Pandora, get the land, you know this stuff, get it set up, and then over time, the right people that show up will become the collective. So now we've inherited something that's considered monocropping. So we are trying to understand what does it look like to have these 4,000 fruit trees that, because it's organic, offers us income, but it is an interesting approach to how to be in relationship with our tree kin. And it's going to take us years because one of the first principles is to observe and interact and just learn and listen to what the soil and the trees and the snakes and spiders, all of the kin there are speaking to us. And what they're screaming mostly now is, can we have a rest? It was also a U-pick, so there was just hundreds and thousands of people coming every year and picking, and there was no real ceremony. So there's been less honoring and asking permission and just listening to the more than human kin. So we are trying to slowly also learn from the mostly, well, all brown men, some women who worked for the previous owners, but they did all of the stewarding. And it's a lot of their wisdom that hasn't also been honored. So we're trying to honor their learnings and listen to what they're doing. And then we partner with Hair and Shadow, which is the first indigenous owned I'm doing, because what does that even mean? But it's the first in the modern context of capitalism, indigenous owned farm in Sonoma. And it's Cultural Conservancy, and they have 8 acres. And there also we're learning from them, what does it look like to be in a partnership where we're honoring where the land's been, where the trees have been through, but then also making transitions that would help all of us thrive together. And last thing I'll say is, one thing we are doing is we're already building rainwater catchment systems. I can't speak for all orchards, but I know on our farm, it was designed on a slope, so there's this idea that when it rains, the design of the farm will allow the rain to kind of soak into the soil and then go towards the down slope of the hill. The only thing is, we irrigate above ground, and so the taproots are very shallow. And so a deeper taproot tree can take longer advantage of that water and that rain. And so a lot of the rain, because the soil is so sandy, just flows. It doesn't necessarily give the trees as much water as they need. So we get all of our water from our well, and it's like, we should be slowing water that comes off of the roof, spreading it throughout the land, and then sinking it. So capturing the water and creating redundant systems so that it's not just the well serving us. So we're going to be building different varieties of rainwater catchment systems and these little rainwater ecosystems throughout the farm to start to create more zonal water relationships. Instead of, it's 14 acres and basically all the water comes from one zone and you have to spread it throughout. What would it look like if, like forest, you have little micro ecosystems where we're capturing water and the water's redirected and it's able to really nourish 500 trees in a particular zone. So diversify the way water is walking and working and in relationship with the trees on land. That is one thing that we're starting now. But we're all kind of coming together to figure out what will it look like for EARTHseed to really be a place for Black folks to come and just be happy and safe and heal together on some land and the Great Rancheria and Pomo communities have honored us and accepted us being there and kind of blessed it. So it feels right. And then my mom's there and she's taking care of me and the land's taking care of her. So that's kind of who EARTHseed is right now. But you're EARTHseed too.
Thank you.
I already know it. Emmett's EARTHseed. We're kind of all EARTHseed.
I'm letting an avocado tree grow in my yard because of something I read in Octavia Butler story about, in the future with climate change, and an avocado tree was growing in Humboldt, and it just stuck in my mind. So I've let it grow.
Wow.
How's
It's
it
like
doing?
it's taller than about as tall as that
That's
roof
incredible.
now, but it hasn't flowered or given fruit yet.
Well, we're definitely becoming more ripe for olives. I feel like it was apples here, and then it became wine, grapes, and probably going to be a lot more olives in the next decade or so.
I have a question for you, Emmett. This when I was watching your movie, and listening to you, Pandora, about the idea of slowing water down. That is an idea that appeals both to people who I think are genuinely focused on the ecological needs of the land, and on people who want to exploit water for hydroelectric and for more water for urban development, and the whole idea that it's an abomination when water actually gets to the ocean. But I'm left so curious about, what do the estuaries actually need? What do the near shore environments need in terms of those infusions of fresh water from the land? And I was reading something the other day in a book I just got about how, I'm going to butcher the science, but it's like there's stuff in the forest that gets in the water and goes into the ocean and is necessary for biological processes in the sea, chemical things. So I'm just so curious in all the work you've been doing in the last 6 years, does that question come up, and have you heard wise answers to it?
That question hasn't come up a lot. Just intuitively as I listen, though, it's like the longer you steep a tea, the more its nutrients are released. So just in terms of beneficial microbes and minerals and things moving from the forest to the ocean to feed the biology of the ocean. If water is moving super fast over those landscapes, it's probably picking up nothing or hardly anything other than a bunch of, debris and pollutants and things. So if it's slowed down in those landscapes, it's still going to make it to the ocean. I don't know. I have a hard time imagining that we could completely stop water from reaching the estuaries.
And yet there's a whole push to build aquifer recharge ponds because we're taking so much water from the aquifers. So we take a lot of water from the aquifers. We build these structures to recharge them, but that's water that's, not going into estuaries. It just seems to be like the bank that people are all willing to take from, and that we're not sort of looking at what are those ecosystems, what's happening to them as we sort of, in Sonoma County fight these water wars on land. What's happening to the
But if we're
ocean?
holding them in ponds or even just in the soil, isn't it slowly trickling into the creeks and the estuaries? And those estuaries and creeks have water in them for longer in the year?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the ideology behind it, is that if you're helping the water to enter the landscape, then the creeks and the rivers will stay full, or not full, but they'll have the presence of water for longer into the season because it's trickling out more slowly instead of a big rush that just comes and plows through and then it's gone and there's nothing left to keep trickling out.
Yeah.
I totally understand what you're saying, though, and it sounds like you probably have some research.
There's a have you heard of San Francisco Estuary Institute?
No.
Yeah, we worked with them. They were created by they're like a government, they're not a government entity, but they were like started by the government to protect the estuaries.
Mm-hmm.
And they've now become a firm that helps communities understand and really think through this question that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I can connect you to them because they're playing in that area of having to sit in those rooms and make those arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And many of their arguments are around nature-based strategies for not just, because the entire Bay Area was dredged at the coast. So all of the estuaries and wetlands were taken out in some areas. So it's almost like too much. It's like, oh my gosh, we can't, in the Embarcadero, we can't reintroduce, So they're trying to figure out the middle ground and everything they say is what you're saying. It's not just, like, our wetlands served a purpose. And now we're talking about sea level rise.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever the sea level would rise before, we had a barrier. And communities have migrated inland before, but we weren't literally living up against it. But I learned a lot from them about the need to think about these areas that are like, they're almost like where everything, there's like a word in permaculture that talks about where the different ecosystems meet.
Mm-hmm. Ecotone.
Ecotones. It's a little late. And estuaries are an ecotone.
Mm-hmm.
And I work in Marin City, and Marin City is in Marin County, right next to Sausalito, and they used to have basically a wetland, and they paved over it, and there's a Target, and guess what happens in the Target parking lot? It floods. And it's like, this is what the cycles will do, and they cut all the trees from the uplands, so they basically interrupted the entire watershed system. And so we're working with the community to do exactly what you're saying. Talk about, if you understand it in a system, what does it look like to make these shifts at each level?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there's enough conversation doing it in the way you're talking about, so that we're thinking of the watershed in an area that's large enough to take all of the things into consideration. I don't have an answer for you, but I'm just saying I agree, and San Francisco Estuary Institute is doing a lot around.
Yeah, that's cool to know about them.
Could someone, for those of us that don't know, just give us the water cycle 101?
Oh,
Maybe,
And
I'd love to hear more.
we can all do it together.
Yeah,
You should start.
Well, there's the big water
Yeah,
cycle
there's a big side.
where
There's like,
the sun evaporates water.
Yeah, I remember
It's a
in third
desal.
grade that little picture, those 3 arrows.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
third grade.
Brock likes to talk about it as its nuclear-powered desalinization plant, where the nuclear power of the sun is evaporating water off of the salty ocean into the atmosphere, where it condenses, moves over land, and comes down as water, rain, or snow in the highlands or wherever, and then makes its way back to the ocean. And then there's the small water cycle, where water in the aquifer and the ground table is pulled up by the roots and bodies of vegetation into the atmosphere, condenses, goes downwind and rains, and creates this cycle. So big and small water cycle are
And I never learned that growing up. I know that water cycle that you're talking about with the
big
picture.
arrows.
And I just actually get quite angry and upset and feel gypped, that I didn't understand the small water cycle growing up. And that's my favorite thing about your film, is how clear that's made.
And why is that so important, that small one?
Because the whole first water cycle leaves out the plants and the trees. And it's like here's the top of the cycle, here's the bottom of the cycle, and it's happening in this big circle without taking into account everything else that breathes in and breathes out along with the big cycle.
And it gives us more of like free reign, or it disconnects the awareness of our impact.
Yeah. So saying we can just take, what percentage of the forests are gone now, and what percentage of land has been turned into agriculture, land for agriculture or for grazing? It's completely missing what's so core and essential to life. And I learned this from Emmett's film.
And also, how many of you learned about the percentage of water on the planet versus the percentage of our bodies that are water?
Yeah.
Or like just the similar, the patterns that exist
Yeah, right.
at the multiple levels.
That's really cool.
So what you're saying, it's too, I learned it as an adult, and then I'm like, wait a minute, so photosynthesis that's happening at that level is what gives life at the larger level with the tree,
Yeah.
Exactly.
We were
So-
duped.
So in this whole California fire region, because I'm in my little neighborhood fire group, and I remember one discussion they had was like, oh, we want a fire break. We want to like take down a huge swath of trees and just clear it out. And there were, other people talking about, well, actually, it's the trees are the things and the roots that bring the water up. That like we would basically be creating a desert,
Wow.
right? And I remember John said, oh, I wouldn't want that. Like that's not what we need. So like that water as connecting to the forest, as like a lot of Californians are thinking of trees as threats, like trees are just feeding the fires.
Yes.
So I don't know, maybe
It's also
We
really
could talk
interesting, though, and then I'll pass it off, in letting forests grow without tending, there are a lot of trees that are holding a lot of water. So in some of the recent remediation efforts and fire planning and prep work that's been doing, where we're taking down certain trees and being thoughtful about how a forest needs to, or is supported and maturing, some of the trees that are being cut are releasing their water back into the aquifer, and creeks are filling from those. So some trees, it's good to remove. What do you think?
Oh, well, I don't know. I want to tell a story about the water cycle. So in the 70s, there was this Brazilian scientist. His name was Enéas Salati. And our book was almost dedicated to him, but instead it was dedicated to our families. And he studied the Amazon. And what he wanted to understand is the rain that falls in the Amazon, where does it come from? The prevailing winds are from the east. So just like you say, the nuclear power distillery evaporates all this water, and it moves onshore. And what he did was he measured the two different isotopes that were in the water, oxygen isotopes, I think, and one was heavier than the other. So what was expected is in the eastern Amazon, you'd have all this heavy water, and in the western Amazon, you'd have all this light water. But what he found was that the proportion of this O18 isotope, which is the heavy one, kept occurring at really unexpectedly high levels all the way across the Amazon. And so it's like what you were saying, that the plants and the sky are having a conversation. And he figured that the same molecules of water were basically recycled 5 or 6 times as the weather went west across the Amazon. And he gave rise to this whole term and concept that people talk about of flying rivers. So there are the flying rivers that go east to west, and there are the rivers on the ground that go west to east in the Amazon.
That reminds me of that saying that, like, when you drink a glass of water, you're drinking dinosaur pee. Or this idea of, well, like, all the water on the planet is all the water we've had, and it's cycled through, like you said, different forms.
Yeah.
Well, your story just, I think, demonstrates how resilient and eternal water is, and how it brings up the grief, of how there's so much desertification and all of the things when it knows how to travel, it knows how to, I guess, survive, and it knows how to, what's the word I'm looking for, persevere. And it's us that, with our water, probably just to listen, remember.
I know the mosquitoes are bothering us, but like
This is the
it's
most mosquitoes
because-
I've ever seen in my life.
No, me too, because I'm usually like sitting over there and there's no mosquitoes. So I've never, but I think it's because the pond has water and the pond is right there. So we have to be a little bit, you know.
And we're all so sweet. I thought that's what you were
They're
going to
not
say.
really biting.
Yeah,
me,
I'm not getting a lot of bites,
No.
but they're sort of, they're buzzing around.
What?
There's
They're
usually
like
like
singing.
a few
They're
of them
like,
over there, but there's so many and it's like unusual, but we are close to the pond.
One thing I wanted to share is in preparing the poetic kind of narration of the film, I did a lot of writing, and most of that didn't make it into the film. But there was this period of time where I had to really let water in more. I had to really be touched by the mystery of water, and one of the places that my inquiries led me was to really feeling how much of I am is water, and how much of all existence is water, and that we're constantly in a changeful exchange.
I love that close up of the eye when you
Yeah,
express that with
coming
that
out.
close up of the
Yeah.
eye. Yeah. Yeah.
And that water is in motion all the time. Like, water is a moving element, and it's moving through us and evaporating through us in the same way it's moving through a tree and evaporating, and we're breathing in the water that's evaporating. So there's this very physical reality to water being a connector, a fabric that is just weaving through all life. And to really let that in is a different thing than to just intellectualize it or hear it. And it was in my sitting and writing and pondering it, I was really struck by how incredible that is. Yeah.
So the approach you took in your film, which I think you described as a more heart-centered, wasn't from an intellectual, like, or a sort of, this is what we should have, or these rules, or these. It was more of, like, sort of grounding your body's experience, or like, yeah, exactly, like how I experience water.
Well, that's like, how do you make
Experience.
policy if you're not, as Pandora talked about, like slowing down to really listen and understand what's needed? So, I don't know, any valuable policy in my mind needs to come from a place of understanding impact and relationship. So, that was the intent with the film, is to help slow people down to look at, with a wider frame, how we are in relationship to the rest of life.
Emmett for president 2025.
Oh, no.
Like in the small water cycle, it's the trees that are sweating and, you know, being in that exchange. And it's like, oh yeah, we're really doing that too. With humidity in the air and like the oxygen, you know, going in and out. And
Yeah,
Oh,
maybe
I
we're
never
part of the
thought,
small
I never
smaller
thought
cycle.
about us as like that. Yeah.
yeah.
We're drinking and sweating into the
I never thought
atmosphere.
about us like that. Well, I always thought about, you know, trees, they're like breathing in, breathing out different. But I guess we're so accustomed to think of ourselves as pollutants. Like everything we do is
we're
pollutant.
giving them
Isn't
what
it?
they need.
We're like the cancer on the planet. Like, aren't we? Like, we're sort of like, why are we here? The animals, they all have their habitats and we don't even have our own
We're animals
outfits.
too, though.
No, we are, but we're sort of like, I think as human beings, we're like in between gods and animals. We see ourselves as like belonging nowhere. Like we don't. I don't know, when I go to
I know.
when
Do
I
you
go to
see
the
yourself that way?
well, when I go to the zoo and I see a little sea otter swimming around, and I'm like, that sea otter belongs to that water. But it's like, what is our habitat? Like
okay.
we go everywhere. We like put on a fur coat and we go to the cold, and you know, we put on some linen pants and we go to the hot. But like, we just don't seem like adapted to our environment.
Which is a different story, like the Paiute people in the film
Yeah.
who've been there for thousands of years and feel a certain kind of belonging that I'm not probably going to know in this life. I can keep reaching for it, but it's pretty far away at this point.
And I think that's why, like, I haven't grown up feeling like a steward of trees. I almost look at your book and think it's sitting over there, right? But it just feels far away in some way, even though it's all interconnected. There's so many options now. You know, I can be a painter, or I can be whatever I want to be, but trees and water, I can't really be here without trees and water, you know, and I do feel personally disconnected to that. So maybe, yeah, I'd love to hear more about your book. And
Yeah.
So I think the question that started it off for me is that organized human societies have a low tolerance for big intact ecosystems. They just look like blank spots. They're unused, and I'm
sorry, can you give an example?
Yeah, so right now in Brazil, where I work a lot, there's a refrain that people say, which is muita terra para pouco índio. And that means lots of land for just a few Indians. Like a low population density is appalling because the area is not being used. And for 20 plus years, I've been working in conservation as an economist. And within a frame that is not heart-centered in the least, but in some pragmatic senses managed to put things in terms that could be influential and, you know, successfully worked on saving some places. But still, it's a trap. It's like Frodo's ring. You know, it gives you these sort of temporary superpowers, but confines you to a space where you have to justify things in terms that in which that sort of space, like big nature, will never make sense. So my sort of original question was, how do you make sense of that? How do you make sense of wilderness? And there's a tradition in the U.S. of romanticism about wilderness that started with the Transcendentalists and goes up through John Muir and Aldo Leopold, and is white guys saying, you know, isn't this a fantastic escape from the Industrial Revolution? We feel peaceful, you know, we feel connection, we feel something. But as these cultural waifs sort of not connected to place, it's not a grounded, it's not a real basis for an ideology or for like a reason for or a basis for a relationship with nature. And also working in developing countries, I found that people are like, what the fuck are you talking about? You know, these rhapsodizing about nature. It's like, we're trying to get our kids in school. We're trying to get by. We live in these immediate relationships with our environment about which we can't be romantic. And so that was kind of the origin conundrum. And yet, as the biological and physical realities are that our planet is screwed without forest. And we're seeing that in climate change. We can't get there if we don't do something about our forests. And so there are these really huge forests that, even though they're really big, most people don't know about them. And so I connected to a biologist who's very well known in my field, and he'd been kind of thinking along similar lines, but from a totally different entry point. And we decided to write a book about big forests. And there's sort of, you know, the 5-paragraph essay version of it is that we need them to deal with climate change, we need them to deal with the extinction crisis, and we need them for the crisis of cultural diversity on our planet. So those are 3 really good arguments. But the heart-centered part of the book is we're never going to get there.
That sounds kind of heart-centered.
Well, but we're never going to get there in the through a path that says we need these places because of what they're doing for us. It has to be, your expression of the more than human kin. We have obligations to these places because there are these kin that we haven't recognized.
And do you write about peoples who have recognized
Yeah.
them?
Yeah, all of these forests are inhabited and
I was gonna
managed.
say,
and that's
'cause
why
it's
they're there.
already- yeah,
And
Yeah.
that's the other myth of
Yeah.
American environmentalism
Yeah.
is that the empty spaces. We love to go backpacking and go up in the Sierra and there's nobody there and we love it. But it's a myth. And the wilderness ideal of America was born after the genocide. So empty the landscape out of people.
Of certain
And
people, out of
big
certain
predators,
people.
dangerous animals, and then we'll go in and sort of have a good time. And
And cut
it's,
it all down.
yeah. And the fact is, like in the Amazon, there are peoples throughout the basin that are uncontacted. Like there are no empty forests. And that was a really cool discovery for me in the last few years. Forests have people in them,
So do you love permaculture? Because I feel like permaculture, when I learned about it, talked about forest design, including the people.
Yeah, I don't know very much about permaculture.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I might
But
be
it sounds
making
like I
look
would love
very
it.
good right now, but there's a lot of craziness. But when you're speaking, I'm like, oh gosh, she's like a permaculturalist.
Yeah, for sure.
How are people responding to your book, to your premise, your hypotheses?
Yeah, so far so good. I think the thing that I love that I hear is that people just enjoy reading it.
It's kind of a hard genre to be in, selling these environmental tales, stories. It's
Why?
challenging for films. It's not the most marketable. People are tired of being confronted with this stuff. I don't know. It's just
Yeah.
hard to be
The
enticing.
depressing ones too,
Yeah.
especially like freaking. What was that movie? I think it was The 11th Hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really
very
was so
depressing.
doom and gloom. Remember, mommy?
I mean, when I don't really watch a lot of television or documentaries, but if I am gonna sit down and be entertained, it's like environmental films are not where I go.
Oh yeah. Unless it's
Yeah.
like, I'd love to see more. I mean, your film was also so feel good and nourishing.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's because I know most of the people in the movie. I'm just like, Ariel.
totally.
But it would be interesting to have more
More
ways
feel-good stuff.
that we're engaging people in empowering, inspiring ways around
And
all these issues.
Theoretically, they are growing markets. So
And how
Yeah.
sad we have to think about it in the lens of capitalism.
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
we know. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I thought I read this quote and then I was like trying to search who wrote it and I couldn't find it. So I really don't, it's not mine. But it was like we have to live off the dividends, not the capital of nature. So that's sort of a capitalist way to think
What's
about
that mean?
nature.
I'm into that.
It means like if you have some money and you invest it and you have dividends, that's like some money that's made off of that money. You live off that. But if you start taking away the capital, then you'll have nothing of the extra to live on. So you want to like
Yeah.
keep that money invested. You don't want to like,
Oh, that's-
well, it's like if you have a tree with peaches, then you take the peaches, but you
Not
don't take
cut the tree
cut
down.
the tree down.
Right.
Oh, that might be good for. Who would that be? Economists? Would they understand that?
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I didn't, but I'm not as
Yeah.
capitalist in my thinking.
They would, but this is something we were talking about on the way up here, is that one way that environmentalists have tried to appeal to the rich and powerful in recent years is to use capitalist metaphors
Yeah.
for things, for nature.
Environmental
and-
services
The
and
carbon
stuff like
credits.
that.
Yeah, exactly.
Carbon
Oh,
credits.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I like that one.
and it's I think it's problematic because it reinforces the sense of the relationship that we're there to take, and we're there to sort of be smart about it and just take the dividends and not the capital, because if we take the capital, we'll suffer. So it still appeals to self-interest.
So what can we take rather? What can we give?
Right. Or what's the nature of this reciprocal relationship?
Mutually beneficial relationships.
And even just feeling grateful, being connected to a sense of gratitude, and like my life is because of your life. Yeah.
I feel like we should relax and have dessert. But if anyone has some final thoughts,
We're going to talk about
Yay,
TV
there's
after
dessert.
this.
steam mic and gossip.
There
No.
dessert?
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah, we can
Yeah.
have dessert.
Well, how about how was this for you?
I don't have a whole vision of what I wanted out of this, so anything that comes out of it for me is beautiful. So yeah.
Well, it's really nice to sit around and have a discussion like this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for calling it together.